It's 2025, and Marvel is back with a new entry in the Captain America saga, this time picking up where Falcon and Winter Soldier left off by having Sam Wilson continue to struggle with the mantle of Cap. This is a very middling MCU film. Nowhere near the lows of Black Widow, but still missing any of the magic that helped its better entries stand the test of time. It cribs most of its plot beats from Winter Soldier and doesn't take any real risks or swings, but is still an intriguing and enjoyable watch. The film opens with Sam and Joaquin, his new wingman, taking on an illegal arms deal in Mexico. We're introduced to the Serpent Society, itself a long-running gag in MCU mythology, led by Giancarlo Esposito as Sidewinder. I was apprehensive when I saw Esposito in the trailers, worried that we'd get the same boring Gus Fring knockoff villain that's been buttering his bread for the last 10 years. But I was pleasantly surprised to see that he's actually having some fun and leaning into the cartoonish nature of this character. Sam and Joaquin visit Isaiah Bradley, the forgotten Cap, and the two have a brief and awkward conversation about Cap's relationship to the president, specifically the current president, Thaddeus Thunderbolt Ross, played here by Harrison Ford, replacing the late William Hurt, who had played the part since 2008. President Ross's violent and warmongering nature are addressed directly here, with most characters who don't trust him, like Isaiah, pleading to Cap to remember how he earned the nickname Thunderbolt. Sam convinces Isaiah to come along to the White House for a special gala, and the next few minutes are full of awkward and stilted humor as Joaquin and Isaiah play off each other for forced fun. Isaiah's character is introduced or reintroduced to us as a grumpy hard-ass, but as soon as they're on the way to the White House, he turns into a goofy grandpa character. Danny Ramirez, who plays Joaquin, is just unbearably bad in these early scenes and really the movie as a whole. Sorry, I didn't like his character in the show, and I don't like him here. His humor is forced, his emotional beats are half-assed, and his entire character is ordinarily written just to be killed off, which sadly never happens here. A sad example of one of the few subversions this movie makes in its otherwise rote plotting. President Ross privately asks Sam to lead the new Avengers, arguing that it's what the people need, an interesting argument that most general audiences have been making, and Sam is hesitant to agree. Ross's main event, though, is the reveal of adamantium, a substance found in the hand of Tiamat, the celestial whose birth from the planet was halted way back in Act 3 of Eternals. The world's nations have been clamoring to get this new goo that's stronger and sexier than vibranium, but Ross is hinging his approval ratings on a treaty that forces everyone to share. That's it. Those are the stakes. Ross needs this done so he can have a good first 100 days in office, and when things go awry with a mind control assassination attempt by Isaiah, Ross ends up locking himself in a bunker for days on end, while Cap and Joaquin try to get to the bottom of an international conspiracy that, to quote Community,
goes all the way to slightly below the middle.
Wait a minute. Something's wrong.
I wish this movie had more to say about the barriers and tensions that exist with this new Cap versus the old blonde hair, blue eyes Cap. I wasn't a fan of Falcon and the Winter Soldier, but it at least made strong lines in the sand when it came to racial issues. Sam and Ross have a tense meeting where Ross is chewing Sam out for getting involved with Isaiah and says something along the lines of, "You're out of your depth, son," which we then cut to Sam looking very angry and grumbling about being called son down the hall. I can't help but wonder if Ross wasn't originally supposed to call him boy here. It can be explained to an angry Sam that he's an old military man and that's what he calls all the young Thundercats, but Sam would know what was really up. It doesn't matter what Ross means, it's what's between the lines. A major through line of this movie that unfortunately is handled much better, albeit through way different lenses, by Winter Soldier and Civil War. The story and nearly all of the plot beats here are mostly lifted wholesale from those movies. We start with a little flashback, then a seemingly unrelated operation abroad where Cap discovers some bigger thing may be at play, then a meeting with an authority figure who explains some shady goings-on that Cap doesn't agree with, then an unexpected attack, usually via mind control, then a sequence where we get to the bottom of things, then a freeway shootout, then a trip to a secluded army base off the grid, then a capture, then a visit to an old villain to get relevant info, then a big third-act bonanza, followed by an old friend getting hurt by falling from the sky, followed by a final, real confrontation to end things once and for all, at least until the end credits scene. It's all there, lifted from both of those movies in an ever so slightly different order, but still distractingly present. This movie's third act is where things diverge a little from the Cap formula, but not in a good way. There's an unevenness to the third act, and the movie as a whole, that's almost distracting. The presence of Red Hulk is teased needlessly considering how prominent he is in all of the marketing, and instead of getting the goods, we're forced to watch a boring and colorless dogfight sequence between jets and our winged heroes. By the time we finally get to the goods, we just get a short fight scene with Red Hulk, who's simply talked out of being the Hulk by Sam, who, as we're countlessly reminded, is a counselor. It's a too tame and overly bland way to end the conflict, and only stings more considering the other villains in the film similarly get stowed away in case the MCU needs to smash the emergency glass again. Tim Blake Nelson is back as Samuel Stearns, finally giving some payoff to a 15-year-old tease, but his entire physical presence looks copy-pasted into the movie, with most of his scenes appearing to have been reshot or recut. His character's plan makes little to no sense either. Ross locked him away and used him as a personal think tank to win the presidency under a false promise of release upon his inauguration. When Ross doesn't follow through, Stearns plans on getting back at him by turning him into a Hulk? What does that do exactly? We're told that Stearns' gamma-infused brain can calculate the odds of anything and everything in the future, but what does that even mean for us? The biggest issue I have with the movie is that it commits the cardinal MCU sin of not having changed anything substantively. Typically, at least one major thing happens in an MCU picture to make you wonder, what's that gonna end up looking like? And yeah, Marvel doesn't always follow through, but at least it provides for an overall sense of forward momentum for the MCU as a whole. In Brave New World, everything is basically the same as when it started. Ross is no longer president, sure, but we never really knew him as president, and we don't get to see who takes over. By the way, where's Rhodey been in all this? Sidewinder is locked up safe somewhere, Stearns' plot was toothless, and the existence of adamantium means nothing other than the fact that legally they can now say adamantium. It's all just hot air. Performances are all over the place here, with Mackie himself giving a performance as Sam Wilson. It's hard to pinpoint why, but there's just not enough leading man energy coming from Mackie here. It's not for lack of charisma. The man clearly has that, but he's working too hard to bear the weight of this cross metaphorically as an actor as well as through the character he's playing, thus making the character much less fun than most other Marvel heroes. He has a nice little speech at the end where he's expressing his frustration at not being enough, and clearly a big part of that is Mackie still struggling with this role after having it for almost 6 years. But it's all too brief a hint at a more compelling overall narrative that got hacked to bits in post. Mackie's distinct lack of unfunnery is meant to be made up for via Joaquin, but as I said, all of Ramirez's deliveries feel forced and rotten. The dynamic of Steve and Sam was great because they were from two different worlds and time periods. Sam and Joaquin are just two dudes who grew up in neighboring states and are maybe 5 years apart. Although at one point during a painfully teary exchange, Joaquin said he looked up to Sam as a kid, so what do I know?
Nothing at all!
I especially liked Carl Lumley as Isaiah, who, aside from inconsistent character work from the writers early in the movie, gives a really heartfelt performance that is superbly emotive without going into ham country. Harrison Ford is fine as Ross, but I couldn't help but imagine what the movie would feel like if William Hurt was on screen instead. I don't mean that I wished it were him instead of Ford, but more in the sense of wondering if it would make me give any more of a shit about the events of the story unfolding around Ross. His main motivations being his approval rating and his long-dead relationship with his daughter mean that Ford has barely anything substantial to work with, so most of his scenes read as one and done. He can sell the juice when he needs to. Pivotal scenes like him almost hulking out or talking to his daughter through prison glass allow him to share a little more depth than the usual grumpy old man routine. There's also a really funny gag at the start where we see a glimpse of old Ross, complete with mustache, while Ford plays up an overblown temper tantrum, which reminded me of the Ross from the old queue of the Hulk coaster at Universal Studios. I love that they brought back Tim Blake Nelson as Sam Stearns, but his acting betrays a sense of not having any clue of what the hell is going on. He's just saying lines menacingly, dressed in some scenes with a fedora and others in a hoodie and aviators. Oof, those reshoots. Essentially making him a TV villain who never really does much of anything. Sure, he can make infinite calculations, but neither the writing nor Nelson's performance give a sense of scale to his abilities or how scary they are. Though again, that's more the fault of writing and clearly hasty reshoots than Nelson's work. Shira Haas shows up as a former Black Widow, which makes no sense because the events of the Black Widow movie would imply that Ross has no trust for these literal double agents. But apparently there were some reshoots or rewrites to alter her backstory, so I can only assume it was just kind of slapped together. Similarly to Nelson, Haas delivers most of her lines like someone who studied for the part by only watching the Black Widow movie. There's a surface-level understanding of the mechanics and rhythms and tones of these types of characters, but I don't think it's too much to ask that an actor like Haas or Mackie or Ramirez make more interesting choices. They are all capable of it, so why not just do that? Director Julius Ona may have had so much on his plate thanks to reshoots and rewrites. There are 5 credited writers on this movie, so maybe he just didn't have the time or means to get really great performances out of these actors. The cinematography work by Kramer Morgenthau is solid, with nice attention paid to lighting and interesting compositions for fight scenes. The shame about the fight scenes is the awful editing, which not only poorly cuts around these interesting fight sequence shots, but also poorly hides the reshoot seams. This one was co-edited by Matthew Schmidt, who worked on a solid few Marvel movies with co-editor Jeffrey Ford, but on this one Ford was replaced with a newer editor, so I'm not sure what got lost in translation here. It's just hog slop. I did really like the score, which has a lot of dissonant noises and small bombastic orchestral numbers peppering the whole movie with a fun conspiracy aesthetic. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that this movie has maybe the worst post-credits scene in Marvel history. It's another weird reshoot, or hastily shot in lieu of nothing at all, where Stearns tells Sam that other heroes exist on other worlds. That's it. We're literally back to 2016 with this shit. It felt like the credits scene from the first Shazam movie. It's so boring and so exhausting. Why not get an established character who knows about all of this shit already just to give him the rundown? Doctor Strange is still out there with that third eye. You're telling me he can't give Sam a heads up about this? All in all, it's not a bad time at the theater. It's perfectly watchable, but ultimately it feels like a placeholder until Thunderbolts is released in May, which makes no sense. Was this supposed to be a second season of Captain America and the Winter Soldier? Was it supposed to be another mini-series like Secret Invasion? Hey, remember Secret Invasion? Remember President Ritson and how he passed that act outlawing all the aliens on Earth? What happened to that? Remember? People were shooting politicians in the street for fear they were Skrulls? Remember that? And how Rhodey was a Skrull? He was a Skrull the whole time, but then they found him in the tube.